That step of the Big Bang, if it did happen, and I think most people agree that it did, it requires an explanation, but you can't have an infinite series of explanations. So by necessity you need something that has to have always existed. In other words, you can't have a situation.
Why can't? So, I guess you're going to say that should be.
No,
God.
I'm not getting to God yet. I'm saying that you can never have a situation where there was an absolute nothing from which something came.
Okay.
Because nothing plus nothing is always nothing, right? In Mecca, they used to hang poetry there. And there were some 10 poems that were hanging there. And when one of the short chapters of the Quran was revealed, all of the 10 poems were knocked off. This became the standard. So the Arabs tried again and again to better the Quran, to imitate the Quran. The Quran says it has an imitability challenge. You can't better it. You can't bring something better to it than this. The Quran was never compiled as one book at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It was an oral tradition. There are 114 chapters in the Quran. They were not revealed in order. The Quran was often revealed as a circumstantial revelation. So somebody would come to the Prophet, peace be upon him, possibly ask him a question, and a few verses would be revealed. No? How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Where are you from, bruv?
Woking.
Woking. Okay, nice. I think the first mosque in England is in Woking, I think.
Was it?
Yes, if I'm not mistaken.
Didn't know that.
Yeah. Are you Muslim or
No, I'm not.
you're considering or you're investigating or?
I'm just. I'd say I'm probably 80s.
Come forward.
Sorry.
Come forward. What's your name?
Robin.
Abbas.
Bus.
Abbas. Nice to meet you.
Oh, sorry. Abbas.
So let me ask you, why are you atheist?
Oh, jeez. Are these all filming? No. That's a bit. It's a bit nerve-wracking.
Don't forget the cameras. Let's have a nice conversation.
I guess,
What's convinced you of atheism? Because atheism is a positive claim. You're claiming that there is no God, basically, and that everything has a naturalistic explanation. So why have you arrived at that conclusion?
I mean, for me, I would say, I don't know exactly how to define atheism then.
Okay.
My position would be, I just don't believe that there's a God, rather than saying there isn't one.
Okay. So more of an agnostic. Are you saying that there might be, but you're not convinced of that, or are you saying that no, there couldn't be?
I'm definitely not saying there couldn't be.
Okay.
I'm saying there could be, but I just have no idea.
Okay, so now from atheism, we've already got you to being an agnostic.
Oh, I don't know. I think because, I think there seems to be two strands of atheism, isn't there? One is
A hard atheism. Yeah.
I wouldn't say I'm a hard atheist.
You're a soft atheist.
Is that soft atheist or weak atheist, whatever it is.
Okay.
So I would just say I'd still say I'm an atheist on that front, but I think
cappuccino would be nice. Would you like something?
Oh,
Cappuccino, flat white, or anything? Please.
No, I'm honestly.
You sure?
I'm good. I got my water.
He's okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
So if you don't mind me asking, what's your sort of background in terms of like study or career? What's interesting?
I work in IT.
Okay.
But I'm also a musician.
Okay.
So I'd say I'm better as a musician than IT. Yeah.
What, are you programming or?
No, just IT support.
IT support. Okay. Okay, that's good. Look, the thing is, do you accept that the universe exists?
Yeah.
And we exist, and we're talking to now, right?
Yeah.
Okay. If the universe exists and it's assembled in a particular way, it needs hydrogen, helium, whatever it needs in order to be the universe, basically.
Yeah.
It requires an explanation because it's contingent, it's reliant on something.
Yeah.
Now, it could be reliant on something else that's material. But if it is material, then that thing must be contingent as well because it's assembled in a particular way. and it requires particular things in order for it to exist. So it's also contingent, and it requires an explanation. You can't have an infinite series of material explanations, because you can never traverse an infinite series of events to reach this event where we are talking today. Because if we had to traverse an infinite number of steps to get to this step, we'd never get to this step. Because by definition, an infinite is something that you can never count to.
Yeah. Okay.
So however many years, millennia, whatever, there's more millennia that came before it. And when you get to that point, there's more that came before it. It's never ending.
But isn't that going the wrong way? Isn't that like, if you look back to infinity, or whatever,
Right.
You've got all these situations that happen,
Right.
and you can say, we can't go back into infinity,
Right.
but right now, well, actually, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't. I'm not arguing for infinity
No,
anyway. I know.
I'm just saying to you, it's a reasonable concept to accept that an infinite series of events can never be traversed. So this particular step necessitates that there has to be some beginning for this dimension, this universe or whatever it is. And of course, we know that the universe did begin to exist, right? And our time, as we conceptually understand it, realize it, appreciate it, is when the Big Bang took place. T equals 0. Instantly time began basically at that point, right? My point to you now is that step of the Big Bang, if it did happen, and I think most people agree that it did, it requires an explanation, but you can't have an infinite series of explanations. So by necessity, you need something that has to have always existed. In other words, you can't have a situation.
Why can't? So, I guess you're going to say that should be.
No,
God.
I'm not getting to God yet. I'm saying that you can never have a situation where there was an absolute nothing from which something came. Because nothing plus nothing is always nothing, right? 0 plus 0 plus 0, doesn't matter how many zeros you have, it's still going to be a 0, right?
Okay.
So nothing, you can't have something coming from nothing, so therefore there always has to be something. And that something can't be contingent or reliant on something else, because you fall back into infinite regress.
Okay.
So by necessity, there needs to be something that has always existed, and the universe began at a particular point in time, in history. So it had to decide when to bring it into existence.
Why does it need to be like a decision?
Because if that something has always existed, and it had the properties necessary to bring this universe into existence, then it had an eternity to have brought the universe into existence. The universe is only 14.8 billion years or 16.8 billion years old or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You understand my point? So if it didn't guide a process to bring this universe into existence and simply had the inherent quality to just bring it in without any consciousness, without any decision, then it had an infinite past history to have brought this universe into existence. But it came in at a specific point in time. So it shows direction, it shows the ability to choose when to bring something into existence.
So I'm not understanding why it's got to be a decision.
Okay,
That's what I'm not getting.
because if it's not a decision and it simply possesses the qualities necessary to bring this universe into existence, then it had an eternity. It had an eternal history, eternal past, where every potential that could have come out from this necessary existence would have already come into existence. Because it had an eternity to do that. But it only happened 14.8 or 13.8 billion years ago. So it must have decided when to bring it into existence. And it has to be incredibly powerful, whatever this thing is. Whatever this thing is has to be more powerful than the universe.
Why is that?
Well, how can something of lesser power bring something into existence that has greater power than itself? If I have...
Could you not have like something like... Could you not say something like dynamite?
Yep. But dynamite inherently has that energy trapped within it.
Yeah.
You're only releasing it by lighting the fuse.
Or like a human... like any thing in existence that a human has created.
Yeah.
Would you not describe anything as more powerful than a human?
But the human is creating from things that already exist.
Okay.
So when he designs a rocket,
so
when he designs a rocket,
yeah.
he needs the rocket fuel, right?
Okay.
He doesn't bring the rocket fuel into existence out of nothing. It's already there. Now God, if God exists, we believe brings things into existence without the need of anything. He simply wills it into existence and it comes into existence.
Okay.
So even a nuclear bomb, an atom bomb, you might think, well, it's only 12 kilograms of uranium or plutonium or whatever it is. Yeah. By the way, just for the cameras, I don't know how to make these things, I'm just sort of saying it as a figure of speech,
you can say anything.
Because a Muslim saying this can sometimes get him into trouble, you know? But let's just say there's this uranium or plutonium. Let's pretend I don't know how many kilograms it is, but there's a certain number of kilograms.
Yeah.
If you fire a trigger at high speed into that, and it reaches critical mass, you get this massive explosion, right? And you could argue, well, look, a human being has created something greater than himself.
Yeah.
But he hasn't created it out of nothing. That's the point. We believe God creates out of nothing. He doesn't need something.
So why do you think then that you need to be more powerful than the thing you create out of nothing?
Because if I'm creating something, if I'm creating something out of my power, out of my majesty, my strength, my ability, my intelligence, and I'm not using contingent things around me, in other words, objects around me to make that thing, then it's illogical to assume that thing could make something greater than itself.
Would God take things from himself?
No, we don't believe that God does.
Okay.
We believe that God simply wills things into existence. It's not a part of God. His power is such that he simply brings things into existence. But my point to you actually fundamentally is the infinite regress is an illogical assumption to arrive at. A necessary existence is very logical to assume. The qualities of that necessary existence point to very powerful, incredibly powerful, incredibly intelligent, because we see in this universe physics, chemistry, biology, all right? We see, quantum physics and all of these things, right? Which the laws of those seem incredibly complex. The ability to fashion those laws or construct those laws, the mathematics, incredibly intelligent. And it seems to have brought this universe into existence at a certain point in time. And to me, that sounds a lot like you could argue, if you don't want to use the word God, you could say the creator, you could say the necessary existence. You could say the thing that brought everything into existence. You don't have to necessarily conceptualize this, because God sometimes is a difficult concept for people to accept, because they see some old man with a big beard with white hair sitting on a stool. That's not our concept of God, by the way.
No.
In Islam, when we say Allahu Akbar, God is greater. God is greater than anything that you can physically or mentally, conceptually arrive at or think about. He's outside of your capacity of understanding.
Well, I've heard someone say that before. That's a difficult one for me to get my head around, because it sounds like you're saying that God is incapable of understanding, like you said. So therefore, are you not saying that you have some understanding of God?
Yes, some understanding, but our understanding of God comes from what God reveals about himself.
Okay. Fine.
So we don't talk about God on matters that we don't know about. So How big is the majesty of God? We don't know. It's beyond our imagination. How powerful is God? We don't know. It's beyond our imagination. When God does certain things, why and how does he do them? We don't know. We believe that that's within the majesty of God, he does those things. But there are certain things that we do understand about God. He's greater than everything. Greater than everything. We believe that he's all powerful. We believe that he is perfectly merciful. We believe that he's perfectly just. But all of these qualities or attributes of God, we get from the Quran, from our holy book, basically.
Okay.
And for me, the argument from contingency is not what convinces me that Islam is true.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's a good a starting point. For me, when I study the Quran claims to be a miracle, a revelation from that creator that created everything.
Okay.
So what I do is I try to establish what are the reasons, or using a probabilistic analysis of the Quran, as to whether this could have just simply been the work of a man, or actually, is it beyond the capacity of human capability and construction? And when I came to the conclusion in my teens that it indeed is beyond the capacity of human beings, and that it claims to be a miracle, that sort of solidifies my faith.
How did you determine it was beyond the capability?
Very good question. So there are many criteria. The first one is for the Arabs of that time, when the Quran was revealed in the 7th century. The Arabs at that time celebrated two things. They celebrated the birth of a poet or the birth of a boy.
Okay.
Because when a boy was born, the tribe was stronger. And when they went into battles, you needed to have men, because the men were the ones who did fighting. The honor of the tribe was the number of men you had, the size of the tribe. But they also valued poetry, linguistic mastery, rhetoric of the Arabic language, classical Arabic. When the Quran came down, it challenged the Arabs. It said, if you're truthful, come up with the Quran like it.
What does that mean?
I'll explain to you. Then it lowered the challenge. Come up with just 10 chapters like it.
Oh, and then a verse like that.
In another verse.
Yeah, okay.
And then in another verse, it lowered the challenge again. Come up with just one chapter like it.
Okay.
So the whole Quran, come up with the Quran like it, equal the Quran. Bring something of the eloquence, the majesty, the beauty, the rhetoric, like the Quran.
Yes.
Then it said just 10 chapters, and then it said just bring one chapter if you're truthful. Now the Arabs tried again and again. The Arabic language of the Quran, when the Quran was revealed, the Arabic language had certain grammatical rules and constructs, just like we have in English. You have certain vowels and past tense and present tense and everything else, and they have to be used in a certain way.
Okay.
Otherwise the language doesn't make sense, right?
Okay.
Right. Arabic has also around 11, I think, grammatical rules at the time and constructs. Even the poetry had certain principles and ways of how you could construct it, what was deemed acceptable or reasonable or eloquent, and outside of that it would be considered to be rubbish. So the shortest chapter in the Quran is just 3 verses.
Okay.
It's Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Inna ataynaka al-kawthar fasalli li rabbika wanhar inna shaniyaka huwal abtar. Just 3 verses. So the poets, the greatest poets of the time, they tried to meet the challenge. So at that time, the poetry was hung on the Kaaba, on the square box, you know, the Kaaba in Mecca. They used to hang poetry there. And there were some 10 poems that were hanging there. And when one of the chapters, the short chapters of the Quran was revealed, all of the 10 poems were knocked off. This became the standard
Right.
So the Arabs tried again and again to better the Quran, to imitate the Quran. The Quran says it has an imitability challenge. You can't better it. You can't bring something better to it than this.
So
when
who was judging? Who was like judging?
The most eloquent authors, writers, poets of that time.
Oh, I thought they were the ones trying to live up to the challenge. Were they?
No, so they were trying to defeat the Quran in its challenge, which was that you can't bring something better than this.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just a bit
So
confused.
okay,
I'm just confused.
so when the Quran was revealed,
No, I get. I was just wondering.
Yes.
I may have missed what you said.
Yes.
Sorry. The greatest poets and writers of the time.
Yes.
They were trying to live up to the challenge, right?
Yes.
But I was just wondering who was judging it.
So Allah says, and bring your witnesses.
Okay.
And it didn't say Muslim witnesses, believers. It said all your witnesses, bring them. In other words, the Arabs of that time were they valued eloquence and rhetoric to the extent where if a tribe made a poem about another tribe, it could be so damaging that the tribe would have to change its name.
Okay.
That's how powerful poetry and the linguistic mastery of the Arabic language and how much value it had at that time. So the people judging would be the ones who are hearing the poetry, and just as a poem would give poetry, the people would offer him money. They'd give him a status. They would elevate that person in their society because they recognize that those words are very eloquent, very beautiful.
So, but is eloquence and beauty, that's something that's subjective?
Yes, it can be somewhat subjective, but there are subjective and objective qualities to those things. So what I've just discussed with you, you could argue it's somewhat subjective.
Yeah.
You could argue that, right? That they heard a speech that claimed to be a miracle that they would never be able to better. And you could say that could be seen as a subjective thing. However, what I would say to you is that on balance of probability, if you have many hundreds of people who are very eloquent, and then you have a person who they knew to be illiterate up into the age of 40,
Okay.
Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he now comes with a revelation.
Yeah.
Every line, every verse of that revelation is more eloquent than anything that you can produce. It doesn't even conform to the grammatical rules and constructs that you had in your language. It's something unique,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Yet it masters and betters anything that you could have ever produced and that you can never better. Not only that, but when the poets are now asked, where is Muhammad getting his words from? Go and find out. Because we know that this is not the words of Muhammad. Because there's no way any man, we know our poets, we know that this speech is not human. So the poet went there, the greatest poet of the time. He converses with Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And he comes back. And they say, where is he getting these words from? And he says, I am of the best of you poets, and you know me. I know that these are not the words of any man. Forget Muhammad, peace be upon him. Any man. I know that these are not the words of any spirit, any jinn. The only thing I can say is that this is some form of sorcery.
Okay.
Now, this challenge was not for you, by the way. So you can be skeptical, because the challenge was for the people of that time who understood those grammatical rules, the constructs, that understood the decades or centuries of literature and poetry. They didn't have literature actually, because the Quran was the first book actually that was written.
So is that test not for you? Do you understand as well as the poets did back then?
Yeah, so I understand some of the objective reasons, not those subjective ones.
Okay.
Because I'm not an Arabic speaker.
Yeah.
So on Sapiens Institute, there's an organization called Sapiens Institute. If you go on that, there is a 75-minute article about the shortest chapter of the Quran that I gave you, as to why there are objective reasons why this is a miracle and that it couldn't have been the work of a man.
Objective reasons.
Objective reasons. So some of those are that you have rhetorical devices within the text, sometimes exceeding the number of words that you have within the text.
Why would that be? Why would that be not possible?
Well, because when you add on a balance of probability, when you add up all of these components that make it incredibly unlikely to be the work of a man, collectively it becomes impossible for a man to have come up with the Quran like it.
Well, I would have thought, in terms of.
So let me give you some other examples, okay?
Well,
which you might sort of find interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, the Quran was revealed over 23 years, from the age of the Prophet being at 40 up to 63, peace be upon him. He was known by his people to be illiterate. He could not read or write. Most people in Mecca could not read or write. There were only a handful of people who could, and any agreement that had to be made, the people would know who to go to write those agreements down. So if I lend you money or you lend me money, then we'd have an agreement, and that agreement would be written down by a handful of people that were known in Mecca who were able to read and write. So he was known to be illiterate.
Okay.
Now just think about this. The Quran was never compiled as one book at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. It was an oral tradition.
Okay.
There are 114 chapters in the Quran. They were not revealed in order.
Yeah.
The Quran was often revealed as a circumstantial revelation. So somebody would come to the Prophet, peace be upon him, possibly ask him a question, and a few verses would be revealed. Okay? There might be a battle, and there might be some verses revealed.
Yeah.
There might be an incident, and some verses are revealed.
Okay.
114 chapters. Those verses were not revealed in chapter order, and this is the interesting thing. And the verses within those chapters were not revealed in order either. So now let me give you an example. Over 6,000 verses,
Yep.
revealed over 23 years. To the onlooker, they seem random. So for example, the second chapter of the Quran has 286 verses. It was revealed over 10 years. The verses within that chapter were not revealed in order. So the Prophet would say, these verses go after those verses and they go before these verses. That's how the Prophet and the people would memorize the Quran. Okay? Whilst Surah Baqarah was being revealed, the 286 verses chapter number 2, other chapters and the verses randomly are being also revealed. At the end of the book, at the end of the revelation, it's one coherent reading. Every chapter contains a word that's unique to that chapter. You won't find it in any other chapter. Some chapters have more than one word. When the Quran was completed, you have man and woman mentioned exactly the same number of times throughout the Quran. Angels and demons mentioned exactly the same number of times mentioned in the Quran. You have the works of Professor Raymond Farrin. At the beginning of his works, he wasn't a Muslim. He knew that this was the way that the Quran was revealed.
Yeah.
In literature, you find certain patterns called parallelism, chiasm, and concentrism. He found that concentric patterns are the most commonly ones that are found in the Quran. But he said that these ring composition or patterns are so complex that for the Quran to have been revealed in the way that it was revealed, verses that were random, often circumstantial, with the chapters not even being revealed in order, and it simply being an oral tradition memorized, he goes, there is no way that you can end up with that complexity of these patterns that exist often within the patterns and within patterns.
Yeah.
He, as a consequence, became Muslim because he said that's an impossibility.
Okay.
That's an impossibility, right? Now that's just one, by the way, I've given you one thing, yeah? The Quran, for example, mentions sea and it mentions land.
Okay.
If you divide the sea by the land, you get the exact proportion of land and sea that exists on the earth to 3 decimal places. Allah mentions in the Quran prophecies, things that have not yet happened but that will happen. For example, there's a chapter called Rome. It's about the Roman and the Persian Empire. And Allah gives a prediction that within 3 to 9 years, the Romans will once again conquer and defeat the Persians. So He gives a specific prophecy. By the way, a prophecy that was counterintuitive, because the Romans were nearly defeated, the Persians had nearly destroyed them. So it's a very counterintuitive prophecy.
Right.
So there are prophecies in the Quran. It talks about that they will defeat them in the lowest land. We find out today that this was the Dead Sea area, that part of the land is the lowest on earth. How does a man in the desert in the 7th century explain that? How does he know that? How does he ensure that there's symmetry within the Quran? How does he ensure that there are exactly an odd number of verses and an even number of verses in every chapter? How does he make these concentric patterns? How does he come up with prophecies? How does he challenge the Arab speaker that if you're truthful, come up with something better like this?
So, okay. The outside of the prophecy thing, because I don't know much about Persians. For me, when you talk about probability, I would just say it seems more likely that this guy was just super intelligent or really smart or whatever, and he was able to create this Quran with all this symmetry and stuff like that. That seems more likely to me than that he got a message from an angel who got that message from God.
You see, when we say somebody is super smart,
yeah,
generally you're talking about a form of
genius.
well, you're talking about a form of
Genius.
autism. It's not just super smart. You're talking about somebody who's hyper smart. So, for example, like Rain Man,
okay,
when the matches fall down or the toothpicks fall down, right?
Yeah.
He says, I think 286, and then Tom Cruise says, how many does it say that there are in the box? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then she says, oh, it says on the box that there's 288. So he goes, oh, you were close. You didn't quite get it, right?
There's 2 left.
Yeah. And then she opens the box. She goes, oh, there's 2 left in the box.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're talking about somebody who's actually not super smart. You're talking about somebody who's hyper smart to the extent where it's like a form of autism.
Yeah,
right?
but we know that people like that are.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay.
But they're not good at everything. They're good at one thing, generally.
But that's
They're not good at everything. So, for example,
okay.
in the Quran, you have legislation. You have legal matters. You have contractual matters of marriage, of business.
Well, okay,
you have inheritance laws.
Yeah.
You understand my point?
Yeah, no, I know.
No, listen, let me just make my point now. When we say balance of probability, what we're saying is it on balance of probability reasonable to assume somebody has that quality and yet they're able to do everything else as well that the Quran does, including the prophecies? And I would argue that's not actually super intelligent. I would say that's bordering on something that's outside of the capacity of what human beings can do.
What about the fact that if he had 23 years, could he not have, spoken to other people in that time? Got there.
But remember what I said to you.
Yeah.
Somebody suddenly turns up and asks the Prophet a question.
Yeah.
How does he script that?
I think it's more likely.
How does he say, you know what I'd like you to do? In 2 weeks' time, come and ask me this question. And in 4 weeks' time, and 3 years later, you come and ask me this question.
Do we know that didn't happen? Like, do we know for a fact that people went up to him on the spot and he answered on the spot?
How do we know anything about in history? How do we verify history?
How do we verify it?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay. Generally, it's testimony.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. But not just any testimony.
Yeah.
Because people can say what they like, right? People make things up, right? Generally, what you find is that, let's say you're at home yourself, right?
Yeah.
Somebody says to you, 5 miles away, a plane has just crashed into a park somewhere. Okay? You might believe him or you might not believe him.
Yeah.
Yeah? You say, well, okay, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. I'm telling you, I just came from there. All of a sudden, your mum phones you. Oh, a plane just come down, and I saw it from my back garden. It just crashed into the park. You know, you might say, well, okay, that seems a little bit more plausible now. Okay.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, your head teacher says to you, "Are you all right? I heard you were going to go to the park, but you know what? The plane just went down there." Now you're more likely to believe. Why are you likely to believe this incident on balance of probability? Because you have a multiple testimony, often in multiple places, all agreeing to the same thing.
Okay, fine.
Okay? So in Islam, we have a very robust, a testimonial, and a way of deciphering and looking at the testimony. So we have multiple narrations from eyewitnesses who have chains of narrations of testimony that have often ended up in different parts of the world, sometimes separated geographically and by time, and we find almost identical. You sure you don't want a coffee or anything?
No, I'm good, honestly, yeah.
And we find that often the wording is identical. So the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said such and such thing. He said, "I have not come but to perfect your character." And then we find another chain of narration ending up in Iraq or in Kenya from the people there saying that this person, and he's heard the Prophet, peace be upon him, say, "I have not come but to perfect your character." So multiple testimony is generally how we verify anything. How do you know your mum is your mum, your dad is your dad? I haven't done a DNA test. I'm presuming you haven't done a DNA test either. But their testimony, the testimony of your uncles, your aunts, your friends, your relatives, everybody else.
Yeah,
I knew you when you were a little boy, and you sat in my lap, and your dad used to do this with you. When you add all of that together, those testimonial, evidences give you an overwhelmingly convincing, reality that actually they are your parents. And so similarly, we would argue that to remain consistent, if we apply a probabilistic argument, what we can see is that this Quran could not have been the work of a shepherd in the 7th century.
Yeah, that's what I'm not quite convinced about,
we can also see from the likes of people like Professor Angelica Newith, not that we need non-Muslims to verify our sources, but as a non-Muslim yourself, I don't want to bring up a Muslim source because you might say, well, he's got a dog in the race, he might be biased. No. We have non-Muslim sources now, like Professor Angelica Newith, who is actually saying that the narrative that the Muslims have about preservation of our scripture from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is actually confirmed rather than challenged by the manuscript evidence that we're now finding. Okay, so we have preservation of a scripture that has things that it touches on nature, that it talks about prophecies that have all come true, and it doesn't get it wrong ever. And in fact, this is the interesting thing. The Quran often makes a claim that was counter to the claim that the Bible was making, or that the Old Testament was making. And it is only later on, many centuries later on, that the Quran is in fact confirmed to be correct, and the Bible is confirmed to be actually incorrect historically. So at the time of Joseph, the dynasty was a king, not Pharaoh. The Bible claims it was Pharaoh. It says Pharaoh. The Quran makes a distinction. At time of Moses, it says Pharaoh, the Pharaonic dynasty. At time of Joseph, it says king. The Christians at the time, they mocked the Quran. They said, look, he's got it wrong. It was only when the hieroglyphics were discovered and the Rosetta Stone that we could decipher the hieroglyphics that we realized actually the dynasty at the time of Joseph was actually king. The Quran got it right. And we find this throughout the Quran. The Bible claims that the ship that settled off Noah settled on Mount Ararat. The Quran says Mount Judy. So it's not copied from the previous.
Yeah.
And what we are now finding is that as these things are being discovered, the Quran is correct. The previous things that were being discussed, for example, about embryology, the Quran talks about stages of embryology. Galen and the other thinkers before that had a misconception. Some of them thought that the seed, the woman was just like a field where the man planted the seed. But the Quran alludes to something that both the man and the woman contribute to.
Okay.
The Quran alludes to that Allah changed your form from an alaka, something that clings, something that hangs, something that's a blood clot. An alaka can also mean leech-like thing, substance. And if you look at the embryo, it in fact leaches from the mother's womb its nutrients. And under a microscope, it looks very much like a leech as well.
Is the Quran the one that says that is it sperm comes from the backbone or something like that? Is that not right?
It's a misunderstanding.
Okay.
It says a fluid emitted. It doesn't say
Okay.
sperm. That's the first thing. And what we find is interpretations of some of these verses that are against what science says is correct.
Okay.
And some early tafsirs or exegesis that actually confirm modern science. So what we don't do, and what we are told not to do, is we don't turn to the Quran and say, "Oh, look, this is a scientific miracle, and you know, it conforms directly with science." I don't use that argument.
Okay.
The reason why I don't use that argument is that I have to be just, I have to be fair, and that we do have very early exegesis that actually line up very much with what science is saying today. And we have certain people who had their own way of interpreting those verses, and they've interpreted it in a way that perhaps doesn't align with science today.
Okay.
But the point is, it's not the language of a 7th century shepherd. That's the point. So when a 7th century shepherd is talking to you about the universe and saying to you that have you not seen, to the disbelievers, that the earth and the heavens were one, and we parted them, and we created every living thing from water, will you then not believe? This is not the language of a 7th century shepherd. Or when Allah says, when Allah says,
He wasn't a shepherd, was he? He was a merchant, wasn't he? He worked for his wife, Khadija. He wasn't a shepherd.
no, he was for the
Jesus was shepherd.
first 23 years, whatever, of his life, he was a shepherd. And then his wife, Khadija, radiallahu anha, employed him as a shepherd. She
Shepherd
employed
is a merchant,
initially. No, sorry. And then she heard that he was a very honest man.
Okay.
So she then employed him as a merchant to sell the goods in the foreign lands.
Yeah, there's more money. Yeah.
And then after that, looking at his honesty. No, but you see, the point I'm trying to make to you here is, it doesn't matter if you end up in a business. My family, they come from India, okay? There are people in India who can still not read or write, but they're millionaires.
Yeah, because some people are smart.
Multi-millionaires.
Some people are very smart.
Exactly,
Genius, yeah.
exactly.
Genius, yeah.
But they're not
So
academic.
you don't have to be academically.
Right.
Yeah.
But then the difference is that they're not academic. That's the point I'm trying to make to you. That they cannot bring up academic things necessarily. They cannot bring up things of nature, of science, that are proven later to be true. They cannot bring up prophecies that come later to be true. They cannot come up with a legal system, a judiciary and a law and a system that is as relevant as it was in the 7th century as it is in the 21st century. That's what I'm trying to explain.
I'm on your side, but you could, for argument's sake, you could just assume that some people are born geniuses, aren't they? Like Mozart, Einstein, Isaac Newton. So Muhammad was genius.
Yes, but you see,
he's genius as a general, as a reformer,
Yes.
and so on.
You see,
that was his talent.
that is an argument. That is an argument that some people bring forward. You
Yeah.
see,
Yeah.
but what we find,
And he was
Einstein was a genius
Yeah.
when it
Isaac
came
Newton,
to
yeah.
mathematics.
Yeah.
Okay,
Like specific, like one
Specific.
Yeah.
you see my point?
Yeah.
You may have a genius who is, you know, a physicist, and he is an absolute world-renowned genius at that. What you'll find with people like that, who are at that pinnacle, they normally have like one color shirt, one color tie, and one color trouser. They don't focus on anything else other than what they're doing, even down to the clothes they wear. I'm being honest with you. So you'll get people that all they wear is a black t-shirt. That's all they have, black t-shirts and black shirts and black trousers. And you'll not see them in any other color. You know why? Because all they focus on is what they... Generally, that's right.
Now, Da Vinci was exceptional.
Now you have
Da Vinci.
you have a leader
Yeah.
known to be illiterate, comes out with a revelation that places a challenge not only on the people at the time, if your truth will come up with something like it, but just imagine, if I said to you, hey, you know, you're my neighbor, nice to meet you, you know, hey, by the way, you know, I'm a prophet of God. I'm going to come up with this revelation, right? Legislation. I want you to accept me.
Yeah.
First thing you do is you say, this guy's obviously lost his marbles.
That's what the Christ did. That's what the Christ did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when the prophet, peace be upon him, first announced that, stood up on the mount, and said, if I said to you that there was an army behind this mountain, would you believe? What would you do? We would gather arms. We would be ready to fight, because we know you
Honest person.
you are Al-Amin. You are the truthful one. His name, one of his names was the truthful one.
Okay.
He was known to be impeccably honest, and the Arabs valued that quality immensely. If you were known to be a liar in Arabia at that time, you were really discarded. You were seen as very low.
Is it not still more likely though that he was seen as a very honest man,
Yes.
and then he lied, rather than?
For argument's sake, yeah.
Isn't that still
Well,
more likely
that's what
than
the Christ
it
believed,
coming,
didn't they?
than it
They
coming
believe
from?
with his honesty.
But that's
They were
just
honest,
where
So
but
look.
they still disbelieved him.
that's just where
Yeah.
I'm struggling to get.
Okay, look.